A abandoned puppy found at church steps. Its shocking true identity will surprise you. The cold November wind whistled through the cracked stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral, a church that had seen better days. The once pristine facade was now weathered, its stone walls streaked with soot from the bustling urban neighborhood surrounding it. Inside, the pews were mostly empty, save for a few faithful parishioners who came out of habit rather than fervor. The air smelled faintly of incense, though its sacred fragrance seemed to do little to mask the growing sense of neglect. Father Michael Torres sat in the dimly lit sanctuary, his hands resting on his lap as he stared at the crucifix above the altar. The figure of Christ seemed distant, almost cold, as though it too had grown weary of the endless struggles of this place. The priest's breath was visible in the chill morning air, his cassock offering little protection against the creeping cold that invaded the old church. For 15 years, Michael had served this parish, offering prayers, sacraments, and counsel to a community battered by poverty and despair. When he first arrived as a young, idealistic priest, he had felt a fire in his soul, a certainty that he was doing God's work. But time had worn him down. He had seen too much. Children lost to violence, families torn apart by addiction, countless prayers that seemed to go unanswered. He had pleaded with God for intervention, for miracles, for any sign that his work had meaning, but silence had been his only answer. Now he moved through his duties with the mechanical precision of a man going through the motions. His homilies were dry, his prayers hollow. Even the act of kneeling at the altar felt like a chore rather than a communion with the divine. Each day he wondered if he could go on, if his calling had been a mistake. It was during one of these moments of quiet resignation that the sound came, a faint, pitiful whimper that broke through the stillness of the pre-dawn hour. Michael furrowed his brow, sitting up straighter in the wooden chair. At first he thought he had imagined it, a trick of his weary mind. But there it was again, a soft, plaintive cry that seemed to echo from outside the heavy wooden doors of the church. He hesitated, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was barely past 5 in the morning, too early for anyone to be out on the streets. Yet the sound persisted, growing more urgent. Sighing, Michael stood and pulled his thick woolen coat from the back of the chair. His joints ached as he moved, a reminder of how much the years had weighed on him. The stone steps outside were slick with frost, the bitter wind biting at his face as he pushed open the creaking door. For a moment he saw nothing but the dim, gray light of dawn creeping over the city. Then his eyes fell to the source of the sound, a small, trembling puppy huddled against the base of the door. The creature was pitifully thin, its ribs visible beneath its matted fur. Its coat was a patchy dirt and grime clinging to it like a second skin. The puppy's eyes, however, caught Michael's attention most of all. They were large, dark, and impossibly expressive, holding a depth that seemed out of place for such a small, fragile being. Michael knelt cautiously, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air.
Hey there.
He murmured, his voice softer than he expected. The puppy flinched, but didn't move away, its body shivering uncontrollably. For a moment, Michael considered leaving it there. The streets were full of strays, cats, dogs, even the occasional raccoon. It wasn't his responsibility to save every one of them. Yet something in the puppy's gaze rooted him to the spot. It wasn't just fear or desperation he saw in those eyes. There was something deeper, something almost knowing. With a resigned sigh, he reached out, scooping the small creature into his arms. The puppy didn't resist, its tiny body limp with exhaustion.
Let's get you warm,
Michael said, more to himself than to the dog, as he carried it inside. Back in the sanctuary, Michael wrapped the puppy in an old blanket he found in the church's storage room. The dog nestled into the fabric, its shivering gradually subsiding as it soaked in the warmth. Michael sat down beside it, watching as it drifted into a fitful sleep.
What am I supposed to do with you?
He muttered, rubbing his hands together to ward off the cold. He couldn't keep a dog, not here, not with his life already stretched thin by the demands of the parish. But as he studied the sleeping creature, he felt a strange stirring in his chest. It wasn't quite hope, but it wasn't the crushing emptiness he had grown used to either. The sun began to rise, casting soft beams of light through the stained glass windows. The colors danced across the walls, illuminating the cracks and imperfections in the stone. Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the altar. For the first time in years, he found himself whispering a prayer, not for the parish, or the city, or even himself, but for the small, helpless creature now resting at his feet. Michael didn't know what the coming days would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the beginnings of faith, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. Father Michael Torres had never considered himself much of a dog person. He admired their loyalty in theory, but the idea of caring for one in the real world, particularly in his current state of doubt and exhaustion, felt like a stretch. So when he found the trembling puppy on the steps of St. Mary's Cathedral, his first instinct wasn't to take it in. It was freezing that November morning, though, and the puppy's emaciated frame and matted fur tugged at something in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. Compassion,
I don't have time for this.
he muttered as he cradled the puppy in his arms. Its tiny body was limp with exhaustion, yet it didn't resist his touch. Michael carried the dog inside the church and placed it gently on an old blanket he had retrieved from the storage room. The creature looked up at him with dark, knowing eyes, and for a fleeting moment, Michael felt as though the dog was silently pleading with him, not just for warmth or food, but for something deeper.
You're just another stray.
Michael said, more to himself than to the animal.
Nothing special.
Despite his skepticism, he found himself unable to leave the dog alone. He fetched a bowl of water from the small kitchenette near his office and tore a piece of bread from the loaf meant for communion. As the dog devoured the offering with surprising vigor, Michael felt a pang of guilt. He had seen countless strays wander the streets of this rough neighborhood, most of them ignored or shooed away by busy pedestrians. Yet this one, this small, vulnerable creature, had found its way to his doorstep, and Michael couldn't bring himself to turn it away. The next morning, the puppy was still there, curled up at the base of the altar as though it belonged there. Michael had half expected it to run off during the night, but instead it seemed to have made itself at home.
You've got some nerve.
He said, watching as the dog stretched and yawned, its tail wagging faintly. It wasn't long before the parishioners began to notice the puppy. During morning mass, it wandered among the pews, stopping to nuzzle against the hands of the elderly women who came to pray. One of them, Mrs. Delgado, chuckled softly as the dog rested its head on her lap.
"What's its name, Father?"
She asked. Michael hesitated. He hadn't thought to give the dog a name, convinced that it was only a matter of time before it wandered off again. But as he looked at the small, scrappy creature sitting at Mrs. Delgado's feet, a name came to him unbidden.
Gabe.
He said.
His name is Gabe.
"Like Gabriel?"
Mrs. Delgado asked, her smile widening. Michael shrugged, unwilling to admit that the name reminded him of the archangel, the messenger of God. It was purely coincidence, he told himself. Over the following days, Gabe began to exhibit behavior that Michael couldn't quite explain. The dog seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense when someone was in distress. One morning, as Michael prepared for confession, Gabe trotted to the back of the church and sat beside a young woman who had been crying silently in the last pew. Startled, the woman looked down at the dog, who rested his head on her lap as if offering her comfort. After the service, she approached Michael with tears in her eyes.
I don't know why, but I feel lighter.
She said.
It's like that little dog knew exactly what I needed.
Michael nodded, though he remained skeptical.
Dogs have a way of picking up on emotions,
he said, dismissing the encounter as coincidence. But the incidents continued. One afternoon, a middle-aged man named Carlos came into the church looking distraught. He was a regular at St. Mary's, though he often sat quietly in the back, rarely engaging with anyone. As he lingered near the entrance, Gabe approached him, wagging his tail. Michael watched from the altar as the man knelt to pet the dog. Moments later, Carlos stood abruptly, tears streaming down his face.
I almost didn't come today.
He confessed to Michael.
I was in a dark place, but this little guy stopped me. It's like he wouldn't let me leave.
Michael wanted to believe there was something special about Gabe, but his rational mind refused to accept the possibility of divine intervention. Instead, he told himself that the dog's behavior was simply a reflection of its need for attention or affection. The strangest incident happened on a Tuesday evening. A mother named Elena, who often lit candles for her son who had passed away years earlier, was sitting near the altar, her face etched with grief. Gabe wandered up to her and placed his head on her lap. Elena closed her eyes, and when she opened them, there was a look of peace on her face that Michael hadn't seen before.
I don't know what came over me.
She told Michael later.
For the first time in years, I feel like I can let go. It's as if God sent that dog to remind me I'm not alone.
Michael didn't know what to say. He couldn't deny the growing number of stories from his parishioners, yet his own doubts held him back. Could a simple dog really be the instrument of something greater? Then there was the incident with the car accident. A man named Javier, who worked at a nearby construction site, had stopped by the church for a moment of prayer. As he was leaving, Gabe blocked his path at the top of the steps, barking insistently. Frustrated, Javier tried to sidestep the dog, but Gabe darted in front of him, refusing to let him pass. Moments later, a car sped through the intersection in front of the church, running a red light. Javier froze, realizing he would have been in the car's path if not for the dog's strange behavior.
Father, that dog saved my life.
Javier said later, his voice shaking. Michael struggled to reconcile these events with his deeply ingrained cynicism. For years, he had prayed for miracles, only to be met with silence. Now these small, inexplicable acts were happening all around him, yet he couldn't bring himself to believe they were anything more than chance. As he sat in his office that night, Gabe curled up at his feet. Michael stared at the flickering candle on his desk. He wanted to believe there was a purpose to all of this, that the dog's arrival was more than just a random act of fate, but the weight of his doubts was heavy, and the idea of letting go of them felt almost impossible. Gabe let out a soft whine, nudging Michael's foot with his nose. The priest looked down at the small creature, his heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear.
What are you?
He whispered. The dog's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Michael felt as though he was staring into something far beyond his understanding. As the weeks passed, Father Michael Torres found himself softening in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't as though he had consciously chosen to change. Rather, it felt like something outside of him, something beyond his understanding, was nudging him, gently guiding him toward the light he thought he'd lost. At the center of this quiet transformation was Gabe, the small stray dog who had taken up residence in the church. What had begun as an act of reluctant charity, bringing the dog in from the cold, was slowly becoming a bond that Michael couldn't ignore. Gabe was unlike any animal Michael had ever encountered. The dog seemed to understand him in a way no human had in years. He would sit silently by Michael's side during his morning meditation, his dark, soulful eyes watching the priest as though he could see straight into his heart. When Michael struggled with a sermon or wrestled with his own doubts, Gabe would nudge his hand or rest his head on Michael's knee, offering a wordless reassurance that somehow made the burden feel lighter. One evening, as Michael sat in his small office reviewing the week's scripture readings, Gabe curled up at his feet. The quiet companionship was oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the isolation that had become Michael's norm. He reached down to scratch the dog behind the ears, something he'd never thought he'd do.
You're persistent, I'll give you that.
Michael said softly.
I don't know what you see in me, but thanks for sticking around.
Gabe responded with a gentle wag of his tail, and Michael couldn't help but smile. It was the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. As word spread about Gabe's presence in the church, the congregation began to grow. At first, it was just a few curious parishioners, drawn by stories of the dog's strange behavior. Mrs. Delgado had told her neighbors about how Gabe had comforted her during a particularly difficult morning. Javier had shared his story of the near-miss accident Gabe had prevented. Soon the pews that had once been almost empty were beginning to fill with people seeking solace, hope, or simply the warmth of community.
Father, I think we need more candles.
Elena said one afternoon as she helped clean the sanctuary.
The votive stands are almost empty every day now.
Michael glanced at the flickering rows of candles lining the side of the church. It was true. More and more people were lighting candles for loved ones, for their worries, for their hopes. The dim, somber glow of the church had been replaced with a brighter, almost radiant light. He didn't know how to feel about the sudden influx of people. Part of him was wary, unsure if their renewed faith would last. But another part, a part he'd buried deep, felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The stories of Gabe's impact were impossible to ignore. A young mother who had been estranged from her family for years claimed that Gabe had somehow given her the courage to reconcile with her parents. An elderly man with chronic pain swore that the dog's presence had eased his suffering. Even the neighborhood children, who often lingered outside the church, seemed calmer and more joyful when Gabe was around.
He's like a little guardian angel.
Mrs. Delgado said one day, watching as Gabe trotted up to a crying child and licked his face until he laughed. Michael stiffened at her words. He wasn't ready to believe in miracles. Not yet. But the evidence was becoming harder to dismiss. One evening, as the last of the parishioners trickled out of the church, Michael found himself alone with Gabe. The day had been long, and his body ached with fatigue. Yet something about the stillness of the empty sanctuary felt different tonight. He sat on one of the pews staring at the altar, illuminated by the soft glow of the candles. Gabe hopped up beside him, resting his head on Michael's lap. The priest absently stroked the dog's fur, his thoughts swirling.
I don't know what to make of you.
Michael said aloud.
You show up out of nowhere and suddenly everything's changing.
Gabe tilted his head as though he were listening. Michael hesitated, the words catching in his throat. For years he had avoided praying, really praying. His faith had once been a fire, burning bright and fierce. But after years of witnessing suffering, poverty, and injustice, that fire had dimmed to ashes. He had continued his duties out of obligation, not belief. But tonight, something felt different. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he'd lost forever. He slid off the pew and knelt on the cold stone floor, his hands clasped tightly together. Gabe stayed beside him, silent and still.
Lord,
Michael whispered, his voice trembling.
I don't know if you're still listening. I don't know if I even deserve to ask, but if this dog is a sign, if there's a reason for all of this, please help me understand. Help me believe again.
The silence that followed was heavy, but not oppressive. It was the kind of silence that felt full, as though it held an answer just out of reach. Michael closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He hadn't realized how much he'd been holding back, how much he had needed this moment. Gabe leaned against him, his warmth a quiet reassurance. Michael stayed there for what felt like hours, letting the weight of his doubts and fears slowly lift. The next morning, Michael woke with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt ready to seek them. As he prepared for the day's mass, he glanced at Gabe, who was already waiting by the door as if he knew the routine. Michael chuckled.
Come on, boy,
He said.
and we've got work to do.
When the parishioners arrived, they were greeted by a priest who seemed lighter, more alive. Michael's homily that day wasn't the polished, routine speech they were used to. It was raw and honest, filled with vulnerability. He spoke of doubt, of despair, and of the small, unexpected moments that can lead us back to faith. And as he spoke, Gabe lay at the foot of the altar, watching over him like a silent guardian. By the time the service ended, Michael could see the change in his congregation, the light in their eyes, the smiles on their faces. It was as though the warmth that had begun in his own heart was spreading to everyone around him. As the church emptied, Michael knelt once more at the altar, Gabe by his side. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The church was quiet, cloaked in the kind of silence that could only come late at night when the city outside had settled into stillness. Father Michael Torres sat at his desk in the rectory, flipping idly through scripture. His mind wandered, unable to focus on the words. The changes that had come over his life recently. Gabe, the growing congregation, the glimmers of hope, had stirred something deep within him, but they also left him with more questions than answers. Unable to sleep, Michael decided to walk into the sanctuary. The familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet comforted him, but as he pushed open the door to the main hall, he stopped abruptly. There at the front of the church, Gabe sat silently, his small form illuminated by the faint glow of the votive candles. The dog wasn't just sitting idly. He was staring directly at the crucifix, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something Michael couldn't hear.
Gabe,
Michael called softly, his voice hesitant. The dog didn't move. The air felt heavy yet peaceful, as though the space had been filled with a presence far beyond what the human senses could perceive. Michael approached slowly, his steps echoing in the quiet. When he reached the altar, he knelt down beside Gabe, his heart pounding in his chest. The stillness of the moment was overwhelming, and he couldn't bring himself to speak. Then, without warning, a warm, radiant light began to emanate from Gabe. It wasn't the harsh, blinding light of the sun, but a soft, golden glow that seemed to flow outward, filling every corner of the sanctuary. The light wasn't just visible, it was tangible. Michael felt it envelop him, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at Gabe, who remained perfectly still, bathed in the ethereal glow. As the light grew, Michael became aware of a presence, gentle, immense, and infinitely loving. It wasn't something he could see or hear in the usual sense, but he felt it as clearly as he felt the ground beneath him. And then, amidst the stillness, a voice spoke, not aloud but directly into his heart.
Do not be afraid, Michael. I am a messenger sent to rekindle the light within you. Your doubts have not diminished your purpose. You are loved, and your work is needed.
Michael's eyes filled with tears as the words washed over him. The voice was neither commanding nor distant. It was gentle, filled with a compassion that broke through the walls he had built around his heart. In that moment, every burden he had carried, his doubts, his fears, his sense of failure, seemed to lift, leaving him with nothing but an overwhelming sense of peace. He turned to Gabe, who was now gazing at him with an expression that was almost human. The glow around the dog shimmered softly, and Michael knew without a doubt that Gabe was no ordinary animal.
you're an angel.
Michael whispered, his voice trembling. Gabe blinked slowly, his calm demeanor unchanging, as if to confirm what Michael already knew. The priest's mind raced as he tried to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. He thought back to all the strange events since Gabe had arrived, the moments of comfort, the inexplicable sense of peace he brought to others, the subtle miracles that had drawn the community back to the church. It all made sense now.
I didn't see it.
Michael said, his voice breaking.
I've been so blind, so stubborn.
The voice returned, as warm and steady as before.
You were never abandoned, Michael. Even in your darkest moments, you were being guided. Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to keep seeking, even when the path is unclear.
Michael lowered his head, tears streaming freely down his face.
I don't deserve this. I've questioned everything. I've pushed people away. How can I possibly do the work you're asking of me?
The light around Gabe pulsed gently, filling Michael with a renewed sense of strength.
Your doubts make you human, and your humility makes you worthy. The light you carry is not for you alone. It is for those who seek it. Trust in the gifts you've been given, and you will see the way forward.
For what felt like hours, Michael knelt there, his heart open in a way it hadn't been in years. He didn't need to ask more questions. The answers were already within him, waiting to be lived out in the work ahead. As the light began to fade, Gabe stepped forward, his movements calm and deliberate. He rested his head against Michael's knee, a gesture so simple yet so profound that it made Michael smile through his tears.
Thank you.
Michael whispered, his hand resting on the dog's head. The sanctuary returned to its quiet, candlelit state, but Michael knew it would never feel the same again. He rose to his feet, feeling lighter than he had in years. Gabe followed him, his small frame a constant reminder of the divine presence that had touched his life. Michael looked around the church, now filled with new purpose. The cracks in the walls, the weathered pews, the worn altar cloth, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the people who would come through those doors, seeking hope, healing, and faith. And Michael, with Gabe at his side, would be ready to welcome them. As he extinguished the last candle for the night, Michael glanced down at Gabe, who was watching him with those knowing eyes.
Let's get to work,
Michael said softly. And for the first time in years, he truly meant it. Father Michael Torres stood before the congregation of St. Mary's Cathedral, his heart full and his soul alight with a newfound sense of purpose. The transformation he had undergone in the weeks since Gabe's arrival had been nothing short of miraculous. The doubts, the cynicism, the despair that had clouded his vision for so long were now gone, replaced by an unwavering conviction in the power of God's grace and presence. This Sunday morning was different. The pews, which had once been nearly empty, were now filled with parishioners eager to hear the words of the priest they had once known as weary and disillusioned. But today they would witness something more. Michael had spent the past week reflecting on his journey of doubt and renewal. He had pored over scripture and prayer, seeking the right words to express the profound lessons he had learned. And now, standing in front of the congregation, he was ready to share it all. As the congregation settled into the silence, Michael stepped forward, his voice steady and filled with purpose. The flickering candlelight illuminated his face, highlighting the emotion behind his words.
My dear friends,
He began, his eyes scanning the faces before him.
I stand before you today not as the man I was a year ago, but as someone who has been touched, transformed, and reborn by grace. I, too, once doubted. I questioned the purpose of my service, and I allowed my faith to wane. I wondered if my presence here truly mattered, if my work made any difference in the lives of others. But I've come to learn, through experience, through reflection, and through an unexpected messenger, that God's grace often comes in forms we least expect. It appears through moments of doubt, through quiet acts of love, and yes, even through the presence of a small, helpless creature.
A wave of murmurs rippled through the congregation. Some turned to glance at Gabe, who sat quietly near the altar, his coat glowing softly in the candlelight. The dog, with his calm demeanor and watchful eyes, had become a fixture in the church. His presence had drawn people in, those seeking solace, those searching for answers, and those who simply needed a reminder that they were not alone. Michael continued, his voice deepening with emotion.
When Gabe first appeared on the steps of this church, I didn't see him for what he truly was. I thought he was just another stray from the neighborhood, another soul abandoned and left to fend for himself. I took him in reluctantly, unsure of what purpose he could possibly serve here. But what I failed to realize in those first moments was that he wasn't just a stray. He was a messenger, a gift sent to remind us of the presence of grace in our lives.
Michael paused, allowing his words to sink in. He could see the emotion on the faces before him, tears welling in the eyes of some, quiet contemplation in others.
Gabe came to us in the form of a stray,
Michael said, his tone softening.
lost, broken, and vulnerable. And in his time with us, he has shown us what it means to truly be present for one another. His gentle spirit, his quiet acts of kindness, have reminded us that God does not work in grand gestures or flashy displays. God's love is found in the small moments, in a comforting touch, a silent prayer, or the unspoken bond between a person and an animal. Gabe's presence has been a quiet testament to the power of love and grace.
A woman in the front row, clutching a rosary, wiped her tears and nodded. Others in the congregation murmured in agreement. They had all experienced the quiet miracles that had taken place in the church over the past year. They had felt the comfort Gabe offered to the grieving, witnessed the peace he brought to the anxious, and heard the stories of those who had found new hope after encountering the gentle dog. Michael's voice grew stronger, filled with conviction.
Each of us has felt the impact of Gabe's presence in different ways. A grieving mother, lost in her pain, found peace as Gabe rested his head on her lap. A young child, too afraid to speak, found their voice again with Gabe by their side. And countless others have felt his quiet companionship, a reminder that they are not alone. My friends, this is what God's love looks like. It is patient. It is kind. It meets us where we are, even in the depths of our doubt and despair.
He paused again, looking toward Gabe, who sat attentively, his gaze fixed on Michael. For a moment it seemed as if the dog understood every word, his calm presence radiating an almost otherworldly serenity.
Gabe has reminded us,
Michael said, his voice soft but resolute,
that no one is beyond God's love, that even in our moments of doubt we are seen. Even when we feel lost, we are guided. Even when we feel unworthy, we are embraced.
The congregation nodded, many now openly weeping. They had not only heard Michael's words, they had lived them. They had seen the quiet miracles Gabe had brought into their lives, the way his presence had softened hearts, bridged divides, and rekindled faith. Michael stepped closer to the altar, his eyes now brimming with tears.
But perhaps the greatest lesson Gabe has taught me is this. God often works in ways we cannot predict. He speaks to us through the ordinary, through the overlooked, through the seemingly insignificant. And it is up to us to listen, to open our hearts, and to see His hand at work in our lives.
He turned back to the congregation, his gaze steady and filled with hope.
I stand here today not as a man who has all the answers, but as someone who has been reminded of the power of faith. Gabe has shown me and all of us that grace is real. It is active, it is alive, and it is always within our reach even when we think we are undeserving.
At this, Michael's voice softened, taking on a tone of quiet reverence.
So let us carry this lesson with us. Let us remember that God's love surrounds us, even in our darkest moments, and let us honor the quiet, faithful messenger who reminded us of that truth.
As he finished speaking, a hush fell over the congregation. All eyes turned to Gabe, who remained near the altar, his golden coat shining in the flickering light. It was as if everyone in the room understood, without a single word spoken, the profound impact this small, unassuming creature had made on their lives. And in that moment, as the church sat in silence, Michael felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He knew that the journey he had been on, the journey of doubt, struggle, and eventual renewal, had not been for nothing. Gabe's presence had been a gift, and his message had been heard. Now it was up to them to carry that message forward, to live out the lessons they had learned, and to never forget the quiet miracles that had brought them back to faith. As if understanding the weight of Michael's words, Gabe turned and walked slowly down the aisle of the church. The congregation watched in awe as the dog paused at each pew, bowing his head slightly, as though offering a silent blessing to each person who had been touched by his presence. His steps were deliberate, each movement filled with quiet purpose. When he reached the doors of the church, Gabe stopped. He turned around and looked at Michael one last time, his golden eyes filled with a deep, knowing expression. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Michael felt a rush of emotions flood his heart, gratitude, sadness, and peace all at once. Gabe had completed his mission. His work was done. With a final, lingering glance, Gabe turned and stepped out into the snowy night, his silhouette disappearing into the cold, winter air. Michael stood at the altar, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the dog who had been the catalyst for his own spiritual rebirth was now gone. But despite the sadness, he felt a profound sense of peace. Gabe's mission had been fulfilled, and in his departure, he had left behind a legacy of faith, love, and transformation. In the days that followed Gabe's departure, St. Mary's Cathedral was transformed. The once dying church, which had struggled to keep its doors open, became a sanctuary of hope and compassion. People came from all over the city, drawn by the stories they had heard of the miraculous dog and the powerful change that had come over the parish. The pews were full every Sunday, and the air was alive with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and prayer. The parishioners, inspired by Gabe's presence and Michael's transformation, came together to support one another in ways they never had before. They offered food and shelter to the homeless, visited the sick, and provided comfort to the grieving. The sense of community that had once been fractured was now stronger than ever. Michael watched this transformation with a heart full of pride. He knew that he had been a part of something much bigger than himself. He had witnessed firsthand the power of God's love, and now he was determined to continue spreading that love to everyone who came through the church doors. In his own life, Michael embraced his role as a priest with renewed conviction. He found joy in his service, no longer feeling the weight of doubt that had once plagued him. He spent more time in prayer, more time listening to the needs of his parishioners, and more time reflecting on the profound lessons that Gabe had taught him. He realized that faith could be restored through small, quiet acts of love and grace, that God's presence often appeared in ways they didn't expect, sometimes in the form of a puppy, sometimes in the form of a kind word or a helping hand. One evening, as Michael lit a candle at the altar, he whispered a prayer of thanks. He thanked God for Gabe's presence in his life, for the lessons he had learned, and for the chance to be a part of something so beautiful. Though Gabe was gone, Michael knew that the light he had ignited in the hearts of the parishioners and their priest would continue to burn brightly. As the flame flickered in the dim light of the church, Michael smiled. He had been given the greatest gift of all, the gift of faith, restored through the love and grace of a small golden dog who had walked into his life and changed everything. And though Gabe was no longer by his side, Michael knew that the dog's mission had been fulfilled. The legacy of hope, love, and transformation would live on forever.